March 7th, 2026, 12 minutes past midnight, and somewhere in the darkness of the Allegheny Mountains, a Norfolk Southern freight train is grinding westbound through Logan Township, Pennsylvania, climbing the grade toward Gallitzin with helper locomotives pushing hard from behind. And the crew is doing what crews have done on this stretch of track for 170 years, fighting gravity and steel and the mountain itself. And then somewhere in the consist, 17 cars decide they are done following the rails, and 2 locomotives go with them. And by the time the dust settles and the emergency brakes lock up and the radio crackles with voices trying to figure out what just happened, there is wreckage scattered across one of the most famous pieces of railroad engineering in American history. Less than 5 miles from a landmark that tourists travel from around the world to photograph, a place called Horseshoe Curve. And when the Blair County 911 Center starts getting calls about a train derailment in the middle of the night, they have to find out about it through their own sources because Norfolk Southern did not call them directly to report it. Now here is where this story gets interesting, and by interesting I mean the kind of interesting that makes you wonder what exactly is going on inside the corner offices in Atlanta where Norfolk Southern runs its operations. Because this derailment on March 7th was the second Norfolk Southern derailment in the same area in exactly 30 days. 30 days. 1 month earlier, on February 6th, around 1 in the morning, another Norfolk Southern train came apart in Logan Township. And that one was bigger. 65 cars leaving the rails near Lake Altoona, just a short distance east of the curve. And the only reason that one did not turn into a national news story is that every single car stayed upright and nothing hazardous spilled and nobody got hurt. Same thing with this March 7th incident. All the cars were empty. No injuries, no hazmat release, no evacuation orders. Just another derailment in the mountains that gets cleaned up and forgotten about, unless you happen to be paying attention to the pattern. And there is a pattern here, and it is worth paying attention to. Because the stretch of track where both of these derailments happened is not some neglected branch line in the middle of nowhere. This is the Pittsburgh line, Norfolk Southern's main artery between the Midwest and the East Coast, one of the busiest freight corridors in the country, and the section through the Alleghenies is some of the most demanding mountain railroading anywhere in North America. Westbound trains leaving Altoona have to climb 12 miles of continuous grade at 1.85%, which means for every 100 feet of horizontal distance, the track rises almost 2 feet vertically, and they have to do this while negotiating curves that swing around the mountains like a snake trying to find its way through a maze. The most famous of these curves is Horseshoe Curve, completed in 1854 by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and when it opened, it was considered one of the engineering wonders of the world. Right up there with the Panama Canal and the Brooklyn Bridge in terms of what it represented about human ambition and technical achievement. The man who designed it was John Edgar Thompson, chief engineer of the Pennsylvania Railroad and later its president, and the problem he was trying to solve was how to get trains over the Allegheny Mountains without using the old system of inclined planes that the state-owned Allegheny Portage Railroad had been using since 1834. Those inclined planes were slow and dangerous, basically giant ramps where stationary steam engines hauled canal boats on flat cars up one side of the mountain and lowered them down the other. And the whole trip from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh took 4 days and was considered a miserable experience by everyone who had to endure it. Thompson looked at the terrain and realized that if he could keep the grade under 2%, he could run conventional locomotives all the way over the summit. But doing that meant finding a way to gain elevation gradually instead of attacking the mountain head-on. The solution was Horseshoe Curve, a sweeping arc that swings around the head of a valley, essentially trading distance for altitude. And when it opened on February 15, 1854, it cut the travel time from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to 15 hours and reduced the fare from $9.50 to $8. And suddenly, the entire economic geography of the eastern United States shifted because you could move people and freight across Pennsylvania without the bottleneck of the old portage system. The men who built it were mostly Irish immigrants working with picks and shovels and horses and drags. No heavy equipment, no power tools, just muscle and determination and whatever engineering techniques the 1850s could offer. They cut through solid rock, filled ravines with earth, carved out a ledge on the side of the mountain, and created something that has been in continuous operation ever since. Think about that for a moment. 170 years of trains running over the same alignment that Thompson's crews carved out of the Alleghenies. Through 2 world wars and the Great Depression, and the decline of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Penn Central bankruptcy, and the Conrail era, and now Norfolk Southern, and the basic engineering has never been fundamentally changed, because there was nothing to improve. It was right the first time. During World War II, the curve was considered so strategically important that it was placed under armed guard. The Pennsylvania Railroad was hauling troops and materiel for the Allied war effort, and German intelligence actually planned to sabotage it as part of something called Operation Pastorius, a scheme to infiltrate Nazi agents into the United States to attack key industrial targets. The saboteurs landed by submarine but were captured before they could do any damage, and the curve kept running throughout the war, as it had during every other national crisis since 1854. In 1966, it was designated a National Historic Landmark, and in 2004, it became a National Historic Civil Engineering Landmark. And today, it operates as a tourist attraction managed by the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona, with a visitor center and a funicular that takes people up to the trackside where they can watch the trains go by. And the trains do go by. About 50 freight movements and helper combinations every day, plus 1 Amtrak Pennsylvanian in each direction, all of them using the same 3 tracks that Norfolk Southern inherited from Conrail in 1999. The traffic is heavy, the grades are steep, the curves are tight, and the consequences of getting something wrong are significant, which is why what happened in February and March of 2026 raises questions that Norfolk Southern has not been particularly eager to answer. The March 7th derailment happened just after midnight on a Saturday. And according to the information that eventually came out, the train was a westbound freight climbing toward Gallitzin, with helper locomotives pushing from behind. This is standard operating procedure on the mountain grades. You put your road power on the front and your helpers on the back, and the helpers push while the head end pulls. And if everything is working right, the train makes it over the summit and the helpers cut off and head back down for the next assignment. The problem is that pushing a train is inherently different from pulling one, especially when you have a mix of loaded and empty cars, and especially when you are going around curves, and especially when the grade is steep enough that the physics of the situation start working against you. When you push a train through a curve, you create what railroad engineers call compressive forces in the consist. The locomotives at the rear are shoving forward and the cars at the front are trying to go around the curve, and somewhere in the middle the forces can start doing strange things. One of the most dangerous phenomena is something called string lining, which happens when the compressive forces try to straighten out the curve by pushing the cars toward the inside of the arc. If the forces get high enough, and if the cars are light enough, the wheels can climb the rail on the inside of the curve, and the whole thing comes apart. Empty cars are particularly vulnerable because they have less weight holding them down on the rails, and the March 7th train was reportedly made up entirely of empties in the section that derailed. Now I want to be careful here because the Federal Railroad Administration is still investigating, and the official cause has not been determined, but the comments from rail fans who know this territory are worth considering. On the Trains.com discussion forums, people who have watched this line for decades were pointing out that the 17 cars that derailed were the last 17 cars in front of the helper locomotives, which is exactly where you would expect stringline forces to be highest. One commenter noted that the train was a westbound identified as 11K climbing uphill, and the manned helpers were pushing from behind, and when all the derailed cars are empty, it sounds like a textbook stringline scenario. Another commenter initially agreed, but then retracted his analysis after learning that the 2 locomotives that derailed might have been the helpers themselves rather than distributed power units somewhere else in the train, which would change the dynamics considerably. The point is that this is not a simple situation with an obvious cause, and the people who understand mountain railroading know that there are a lot of variables involved, and jumping to conclusions before the investigation is complete would be irresponsible. But what is not speculation is that Norfolk Southern has now had 2 significant derailments on the same stretch of track within 30 days, and that raises questions about maintenance and operations and inspection practices that the railroad has not publicly addressed. What makes this particularly awkward for Norfolk Southern is the timing. Just 6 weeks before the March 7th derailment, on January 27, 2026, the company released its 2025 safety report with considerable fanfare. The headline numbers were impressive: a 31% reduction in FRA reportable train accident rate compared to 2024, a 15% reduction in injury rate, and the company claimed this was its best safety performance in more than a decade. Norfolk Southern's chief safety officer told reporters that the company had implemented something called PSR 2.0, which integrates safety with operational excellence in a way that had not been reinforced historically. The National Transportation Safety Board sent a letter in January 2026 praising the company for fulfilling every new safety recommendation from its 2024 report on the East Palestine derailment. And then came February 6th with 65 cars on the ground near Lake Altoona. And then came March 7th with 19 pieces of equipment, including 2 locomotives scattered across the mountain. And suddenly, the 31% improvement number starts looking a little different. This is where the history of the past 3 years becomes relevant. On February 3, 2023, a Norfolk Southern freight train carrying hazardous materials derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, and what happened next became a national scandal. Tank cars carrying vinyl chloride caught fire. Norfolk Southern made a decision to vent and burn the chemicals to prevent what they said was an imminent explosion. A massive toxic plume rose over the town. Thousands of residents were evacuated, and the company's handling of the disaster drew bipartisan condemnation from everyone from Ohio's Republican governor to Senate Democrats to the National Transportation Safety Board itself. The NTSB found that the derailment was caused by a bearing failure that should have been detected by wayside detectors along the route, and that Norfolk Southern's decision to vent and burn was based on incomplete and misleading information and turned out not to have been necessary at all. Before East Palestine, Norfolk Southern had the fastest growing accident rate in the industry according to federal data. An NBC News analysis found that from 2018 to 2022, the company averaged slightly more accidents per million miles than the other 6 Class 1 railroads, and while the total number of accidents had dropped, the rate had stayed flat because mileage had also declined. Union leaders said the company was one of the worst railroads in the country, and the FRA's own safety culture assessment found that Norfolk Southern was still using minimum standards in some areas months after East Palestine, so the company had a lot of ground to make up. And to their credit, they appear to have made significant investments in safety technology and training and culture change. They deployed new wheel integrity systems using cameras and artificial intelligence to spot defects. They expanded participation in the FRA's confidential close call reporting program. They held safety summits with union leaders and rolled out training programs to encourage employees to speak up about concerns. And the numbers did improve, at least according to the metrics the company reports. But metrics can be misleading, and corporate safety reports are not the same as operational reality on the ground in the middle of the night in the Allegheny Mountains. The dispatch audio from the March 7th derailment tells a story that the safety report does not capture. According to WJAC television, which obtained the radio transmissions, a member of the helper crew can be heard asking the engineers about the contents of one of the tank cars on the train. Norfolk Southern says all the cars were empty. But the fact that a crew member apparently did not know what he was pushing raises questions about communication and situational awareness that go beyond statistics about accident rates. WJAC asked Norfolk Southern to comment on why an engineer would not know what was in a tank car he was helping to shove over the mountain. As of their last report, the company had not answered the question. And then there is the matter of how Norfolk Southern communicates with local emergency services. The Blair County 911 Center told WJAC that they were not directly notified about the March 7th derailment by the railroad, and instead learned about it through their own sources. This is the same railroad that was criticized after East Palestine for how it shared information with first responders. And one of the things the NTSB specifically praised in its January 2026 letter was improvements in how Norfolk Southern communicates with emergency personnel during incidents. 37 days later, the local 911 center is finding out about a derailment through the grapevine. The cleanup from the March 7th incident went quickly by railroad standards. Norfolk Southern had some rail service restored through the mountain by Saturday evening, and full service on all lines returned just after midnight Sunday morning, less than 24 hours after the derailment. The Amtrak Pennsylvanian was canceled for the day, and passengers had to take buses between Pittsburgh and Johnstown, but by the following day, everything was back to normal. The FRA sent investigators to the scene, and the cause remains under investigation. Unless something unusual comes out of that investigation, this derailment will become just another entry in the federal database, forgotten by everyone except the rail fans who keep track of such things, and the people who live along the line and wonder every time they hear a train in the night. Horseshoe Curve will continue to operate as it has for 170 years. The trains will keep climbing the grade from Altoona and descending into Johnstown. The helpers will keep pushing and cutting off. The tourists will keep riding the funicular to the overlook and taking photographs of the freights rolling through one of America's most famous railroad landmarks. Norfolk Southern will keep issuing safety reports and talking about culture change and operational excellence. And the accident rate will fluctuate up and down depending on which metrics you choose to emphasize. And somewhere in Atlanta, there is presumably someone who has to explain to the board of directors why the company's showcase safety statistics from January are looking less impressive in March, and why the same stretch of track that the Pennsylvania Railroad built 170 years ago to be the safest and most efficient route over the mountains has now produced 2 derailments in 30 days. Maybe there is a good explanation. Maybe it is just bad luck. Maybe the track conditions are fine, and the equipment is sound, and the operating practices are appropriate, and this was simply one of those things that happens when you run heavy trains over steep grades, through tight curves in the middle of winter. Or maybe there is something else going on that the 31% improvement number does not capture, something that the FRA investigation will eventually reveal, something that the crews working the mountain grades already know, but cannot say publicly without risking their jobs. The railroad industry has a long history of that kind of gap between official statistics and ground-level reality, between what the safety reports claim and what the employees experience, between what the company tells regulators and what actually happens on the tracks at 12 minutes past midnight when nobody is watching except the mountains and the darkness, and the men in the locomotives trying to keep 17,000 tons of steel on the rails. 2 derailments in 30 days, same stretch of track, same railroad. 1 month after the company's best safety report in a decade. The FRA is investigating, Norfolk Southern is not commenting, and Horseshoe Curve keeps running as it has since 1854, waiting to see what happens next.